Over the last 75 years, over 10,000 chemicals have been introduced to our food supply. Yet the EU only allows 300 food additives. But at Thrive Market, we bring our members the highest quality brands and restrict more than 1,000 ingredients found at conventional grocery stores, making the switch as easy with our Healthy Swaps scanner, which finds better versions of all your favorite pantry, snacking, and home essentials without the added junk, dyes, and fillers. Plus, it's all delivered straight to your door. So if you're looking to shop at a grocery store that actually cares about your health, go to thrivemarket.com/podcast and you'll get 30% off your first order and a free gift.
What's up, everybody? Welcome back. Corey Hughes, Bloody History. Continuing on with Mother in History, the book that came from the interview between Gene Stafford and Marguerite Oswald. So, the room was still cool, but the air was heavy, imbued with the secondhand mustiness of air conditioning and the smoke from my cigarettes. I was tired and headachy, but Mrs. Oswald was as fresh and kinetic as she had been when she greeted me, and she persevered like a long-distance runner. You know, there was a violent campaign against me, as well as my son, in magazines, newspapers, and written literature. Most all the papers pictured me in a sort of bad light, but really, I'm not that way at all and never was. I should say I'm very outspoken. I'm aggressive. I'm no dope, let's face it. If you step on my toes, I'm gonna fight back, and I don't apologize for that. This was my training along with Lee's father, who, as we all know, is now deceased. Although I should have been used to it by now, I was surprised each time she used the royal or tutorial we, and only the most tenuous hold on reality kept me from glancing from left to right to see who besides me was attending this lecture. When my older boy first went to school, he came home one day crying that the children had taken his pennies away from him. Mr. Oswald took his little hand and started teaching him how to fight back. And then I listened. I thought it was a wonderful thing. I remember him saying, if you ever start a fight, you're going to be whipped. But if they ever start a fight with you and they don't fight back, and then you don't fight back, I'm going to whip you. Let me give you one little instance with Lee and the next door neighbor boy. They were approximately the same age, and if not, they were the same height. And Lee had a dog. He loved his shepherd collie dog. His name was Sunshine. He used to romp in the backyard with his dog and took him every place. And this little boy was throwing rocks over the fence at Lee's dog. Well, my kitchen window had a view to the backyard, and I watched my son Lee for approximately 3 days, telling the little boy over the fence he better stop throwing rocks at his dog. Well, I was amused, and I was just waiting to find out what had happened. Finally, one day when I came home from work, the father called me on the phone. It seemed his son was very badly beaten up in a child's way. My son Lee had finally taken it upon himself, after much patience, I thought, to confront the little boy enough to fight him. And the father didn't approve. I told the father what had happened, and since the boys were approximately the same age and height, let them fight their own battles. Now my boys were never tied to my apron strings, and Lee wanted to know all there was about life, talking about going to Russia. He wrote in Russian and he read Russian. Why? Because my boy was being trained as an agent. That's why. Another thing I found out in some book where it said he was placed in another hut because he couldn't get along with somebody. He was placed with a Cuban and he was learning Spanish. I think he was spying on that Cuban. It's just too obvious. Seems she's talking about Delgado. How many Marines, but he's actually a Puerto Rican, how many Marines are going around reading Russian and getting Russian newspapers? 1 and 1 make 2 to me. The boy was being trained. I asked her what she thought Lee would have done with his life if he had not been killed, and she answered at once, as if she had answered this question many times before. From what I know of my boy, and of course you have to understand that actually the last time I was very close to Lee was before he joined the service in 1956. After that, it was just through correspondence and on his leaves home from the Marines that I knew him. But every time he came home, he talked and talked about the Marines and nothing else. I know when he came back from Japan, he said, "Oh, what a wonderful experience, what a wonderful trip." He said, "Do you know it cost my government over $2,000 to send me there? I could never afford it on my own." I think he was doing with his life what he wanted to do. And I'm going to say he was working for his country as an agent. I think that at age 16, he became involved. That at age 16, Lee Harvey Oswald was being trained as a government agent. And this brings up Russia and, of course, Marina. I was glad she broadcast the subject of her daughter-in-law. I had been shy of doing so myself because I know there was bad blood between the two women. "Let's have some more coffee before I go into that," she said. "We'll need it." She went once again to the kitchen with her back to me, and she went about the business of the coffee. She honed her scalpels for the vivisection of Marina. Of course, I don't know too much about Marina. She lived with me the 1 month when they came back from Russia. She was a very humble foreign girl, and she never smoked in front of me. Everything was mama and the baby, and we got along fine. Now, this person never smoked in front of me for a reason, because she did smoke, and she smoked in Russia. The testimony of presidential report showed that she knew Americans before she knew Lee, and they taught her how to smoke. Now, I smoked for 20 years, and Lee never did say a word about me smoking. Maybe she had respect because I was a mother, but he objected to his wife smoking. And she evidently thought I never smoked because she never smoked in front of me. I didn't know Marina smoked until the assassination. At the moment, like a white rat in some unprecedented experiment, I had lighted a cigarette in my hand, and another was burning in the ashtray. And you see, I wouldn't be that type. I would be natural, and I would do what I have to do. And there again, we get into she's not a true person. If I smoke in front of everybody, of course. I would ask permission of an older person. There was a moment of silence, and I tried to remember if I had minded my manners at the beginning and asked if I could smoke, and I thought I had, but at this point I could be sure of nothing except that I was a white rat. "To me, Marina is not a true person," she said, with fair-minded deliberation. And this is hard to explain. I have to ask myself who Marina Oswald really is. I'd like to see her marriage certificate sometime, and I'd like to know more about her. Oh, and when Marina went to Washington fell in love with Marina Oswald, and Chief Justice Warren was her grandfather. But when I just went to Washington, don't listen to her mama, hadn't seen Lee in a year, and she doesn't know anything, blah, blah, blah. Everything was against me, yet I was the mother. Now, I don't say that Marina is necessarily guilty of anything, but both she and Mrs. Payne have lied continuously. Maybe they are not guilty, but why is it necessary to lie? When it first happened, Marina did not identify the rifle. She said, yes, Lee had a rifle, but when they showed it to her, she said she couldn't say whether that was his. Now this is understandable. If your husband had a rifle, and particularly if he had, as they say he had, wrapped it up in a blanket and never using it, would the wife be able to identify it? Yet a few weeks later, when she had taken the oath and had been brainwashed by the Secret Service, she identified the rifle as Lee's. And at first she said, Lee's a good man. Lee no shoot anybody. And then she changed her testimony. Marina seems French to me. French! Yes, sweetheart, that's what I said. Marina Oswald seems French to me. Oh, definitely. She came back with our coffee and she put it down beside me and said, but that will have to be continued in our next. You'll have to drink up, honey. Your driver's here. I had not heard a car, and shrubbery obscured the window that looked outside the street. But when I peered through the interstitices of the privet, I saw that she indeed was right, and the car to take me back to Dallas was here, where I was staying, was at the curb. I began to respect the sixth sense she had several times laid claim to. I have a very unusual extrasensory perception, she had said once, so it doesn't stand to reason that if my boy shot the president, I would have known at the time it happened. I respected also her dramatic sense of timing, and I wondered how I would hang to the cliff until I heard Marina's French origins. As I got up to go, I asked her if she would object to my bringing a tape recorder the following day. She said on the contrary, she would be glad if I did. That is, if I brought two machines, since she wanted to tape one to preserve it for history. She had made many recordings, she told me, for mass mediums and for her own purposes. She knew that she spoke at the rate of 180 words a minute, and I was to tell that the man I rented the machines from, an operator, would not be necessary because she knew how to work them all. I started toward the bedroom to fetch my Neiman Marcus rain cape, and my eye drifted willy-nilly towards the scroll over the desk. I did not look at it directly, but instead at a tempera of wood on a Baroque orange and chestnut newel post, a detail from backstairs at Blenheim Castle from Marion Davies' house, which she dismissed. A little decorator thing. I thought it would go with the chair, but now this is important. This is what you should see. And she took the scroll down from its hook. I was to show you this, she said. Here, the man can wait. I guess he's getting paid, isn't he? You get out your notebook and copy it down and be sure to get the words right. The legend, cut into copper, read, "My son, Lee Harvey Oswald, even after his death, has done more for his country than any other living human being. Marguerite C. Oswald." As I was writing down this obtrusive manifesto, I could not get a purchase on the syntax. Mrs. Oswald brought my things and smiled disarmingly. "Of course, I'm not a writer like you," she said, "but I like how that sounds. That's what I have said at the year period when I went to the grave. Newspaper reporters came by galore and asked if I had anything to say, and I said this, and every word of it is true. I'm proud of my son, and why not? My son is an unsung hero." I remembered that she had petitioned to have Lee Harvey buried in Arlington Cemetery. I thanked her for giving me so much of her time, and I thanked her for the coffee. Her hand clasp was firm and straightforward, and her eyes shone with zeal and satisfaction and optimism. We're going to win in the end. I was not sure whether the "we" was editorial or whether I had now been initiated into a coterie of whose adversaries were they. On the drive back, I browsed through some materials Mrs. Oswald had lent me. One was a paperback book by Carey Thornley, who had known Lee Oswald in the Marines and had dedicated his iconoclastic critique on how America helped Oswald to become what he did to Clint Bolton, who first said to me, "Go home and write, you bum." I did not get much further than that. The other was a pamphlet proving that it was ballistically impossible for Oswald to have killed Kennedy. This was a compilation of diagrams and of copies of letters that had been sent accompanying to the diagrams to the leading magazines and to people of position. The letters significantly had gone unanswered or had been brushed aside. A ferocious admonition in the beginning of the text prevents me from quoting any part of it. Soon after the assassination, my husband got a good many letters addressed to him in his role as critic of the press. Most of them told him how to go about his reporting, and most of them went into the wastepaper basket. He was, as a matter of fact, at work on one of his wayward press analyses for the New Yorker just before he died, a little more than a month after the president was killed. He brought home for me to read one of the letters, whose author implored, "Mr. Liebling, go to Dallas and tell us the truth. You might, of course, get killed in Texas, but if you get killed, the world shall know that somebody from the right, be it Birchers or Southern Democrats, want to hide the truth." Exegetes of Dallas murders sprang up like mushrooms in the pine woods after the soaking rain. The mycelium at the round earth's four corners were rich and ready. Many of the toadstools that appeared were harmless but without flavor. Some were tasty, even delicious. Many more were as noxious as the Amanita verna. In the cities, in whose purlieus those mycologist wonderlands flourished, kangaroo courts met round the clock. And some of the judges and some of the jurors were responsible people, and the opinions they handed down were persuasive. They were shooting in the dark, but they managed to convince themselves and millions of others that their shots dispelled the darkness and everything was limpidly illuminated. Theory, creative and flexible, made of mincemeat, of circumstantial evidence. The name of the prisoner in the dock was Legion. He had pigmentation in every shape of jaw known to anthropology. He was a member of every political organization, every religious fraternity, every business, scientific, criminal, occult conclave of every country on the face of the earth. In some of these courtroom spectaculars, the remarks from the peanut gallery were deafening. The confusion was such that one could not remember which were the good guys and which were the bad ones among Mark Lane, Perry Mason, Melvin Belli, and the Defender's man, let alone which belonged to the Bar Association and which to the American Federation of Radio and Television Artists. Lee Harvey Oswald was convicted of having pulled the trigger, but at the instigation of a highly organized and dangerous gang. In other reenactments of this drama, he was not even on the premises, but was under a haystack fast asleep in Europe, where there had never been an assassination of a political figure for an apolitical individual reason. The idea that Oswald, obscure, untortured, could have acted on his own was insupportable, and the most important papers of the most important capitals carried stories categorically proving conspiracy. As we entered Dallas and drove along the route of the president's caravan, I observed, as I had the other two times I had been over this same ground, with the distance between the sixth-floor window of the Texas Schoolbook Depository and the place where the car, slowing for a turn, had been seemed much less than it appeared in the photographs. I was struck, moreover, by the fact that between the window and the target there was no obstruction of any kind to challenge, aim, or deflect the attention, or eave, or overhang, or tree. The drop shot from a steadied rifle and fired on a day of surpassing clarity, the marksmanship of a gunner, did not have to be remarkable. So obviously that's a total cover-up statement as we come to the end of part one. Because there was that big fucking tree right there. It's obvious it was there on the day of the assassination. It was there a year later. It was there 6 months later. It had always been there. But to me, stuff like that is irrelevant. Shots fired from that window were fired by Lawrence Howard, and they were irrelevant if they hit anything or not. All he had to do was stick the rifle outside of the window. Part 2. Having taken Mrs. Oswald at her word, I refused the offer of a lesson in manipulation when the man delivered the tape recorders to my hotel. This was unwise, despite her boast that she could work 'em all. Mrs. Oswald couldn't work these, and I had never clapped eyes on a tape recorder before in my life. After a quarter of an hour of bungling experimentation, plugging and unplugging, punching buttons and shifting levers, reversing bobbins, profitlessly studying instructions that might as well have been written in Arabic, and possibly were, we were both exasperated, sitting on the floor with our hair awry, amid furniture that we had dislodged in our futile fiddling. We were exasperated with the contraptions and with each other. Mrs. Oswald said with some asperity that these were inferior machines, that I should not have cut corners when matters of such importance were at stake. I felt as defensive as the machines belonged to me. I wanted to invent an affidavit from Consumer Reports to fling before her, but having chosen to do so, I should have learned how to run the trashy thingamabobs. She went to the bedroom and telephoned the shop to ask for help, and while she was gone, Lady Luck visited me in a dazzling revelation and piloted my fingers in a virtuoso performance, unique in my experience, so that when she came back with the disgruntling news that since it was Saturday the shop was closed, I was delighted to point to the smooth, revolving wheels. In that moment, I became 8 years old, and having just outwitted one of my smug older sisters, it was all I could do to keep from yammering like a monkey. Well now, if we just keep at the thing, we'll get to it in the end, isn't that the truth? She cried, pleased with her stick to it incisiveness, which had been borne practical fruit as well as an opportunity to express an eternal verity. Oh, I can tell we'll work well together. Right here it's proved that together we're a mechanical genius. We stationed ourselves in the chair, I in the chair where I had sat the day before, and Mrs. Oswald beneath Whistler's old lady. She picked up her microphone and spoke into it clearly, because she never groped for a word and because her undertones and overtones and rhythms altered at such cleverly strategic times. The only visible member of her audience was caught up and indoctrinated when I heard grumblings from the back of the house that her arguments were specious, her logic bizarre, and her deductions plucked from the foggy air. Now about Marina being a true or untrue picture, she said, stating the text for the day. Marina and I, as I have said, seems French to me. I have researched everything about Marina over and over. When she went to New Orleans, she did not want to live in an apartment with high ceilings. Now, where does she know about the high ceilings? There may be a simple answer for this and all the other things, but I don't have it, and I want it. And she complained about the cockroaches, which is all right, but a foreign girl knows how to clean up things, and then, of course, she knew a little French, too. Considering that she was French, the fact that she knew a little French, too, must have been useful. There's one letter in the Warren Report from Russia, from Lee, that said he married this girl and she spoke a little French. Well, the letters had to be retyped because they didn't photograph well, and they are omitted the word French. If you use a magnifying glass and look at Lee's letter, you will see that Marina speaks a little French. Now I ask myself, was this deliberate, or was this just an error? But when you find so many errors and so much coincidence, then you begin to wonder if something being whitewashed, and if there isn't something more to it than meets the eye. Wow, that paragraph, is, I don't know about Marina being French, but in regards to everything else, is pretty goddamn spot on. And Marina knew English. Marina and I conversed, and I don't know Russian, and this is the part that I was indignant about, because after she went to live with Mr. Martin in his home with his family, they put her on television, and that day she spoke real well broken English, and they said she didn't know English. That's baloney. She could understand, but when she went out to any place, she didn't open her mouth, and she made it out like she didn't speak or understand English. This is what I mean when I say she's not a true person. But why do you think she's French? I insisted, not at all satisfied with the proposition that an aversion to high ceilings and cockroaches was idiopathically Gallic. I wish I could go into this, I do truly, but it's just like, how do I love you? It's just like something that doesn't make any sense, and you know it, you feel it. But when I first met her and I saw that she didn't look Russian, she doesn't look Russian at all. I recalled that when I had seen the first photographs of Marina, I had been reminded of the flawed beauty of the girls in the Soviet films of a few years ago. The imperfections of skin and teeth of Veronica and the cranes are flying had been inexplicably touching. Today, Oswald's widow is much different, cropped and kempt and styled, but at the time, no face had looked to me more Chekhovian or Dostoevskian or Pushkinesque. She could have been Lisa in Pique Dame, designed to hurl oneself into the Neve as the sad snow fell all around her, or Masha, or all of these three sisters, the one given most to tears. Mrs. Oswald, however, stated unequivocally, she looks French, and that was that. Now the only thing that I'm sure of is that I had nothing to do with the assassination. I'm not sure about anybody else, and because I am looking for truth, everyone is under suspicion in a way. You see, I don't know who's who. I have to evaluate everybody, and Marina doesn't ring true to me. Of course, I never hear anybody else say she was French, but I have my reasons for saying this, which will be very delicate. She doesn't ring true to begin with in respect to motherhood. Even if she thinks in her mind that Lee was guilty, the thing to do was protect him for her children's sake and for her sake. No, I'm not talking about lying because I don't believe in lying, but I mean to give out stories like as if she had met him outside Russia, she would never have married him because of the type he was and so on and so forth. That just downing him more and more, and yet she's the mother of his children. That is not true of motherhood or womanhood. Even if he was a louse, she would defend him to a certain extent. She never goes out to the cemetery. She did in the very beginning. She went out and everything was fine, and then she was taken over. She started changing, and whether it was for the security of the country, whether it was for her role, whether she's being threatened, which is a possibility, whatever reason, it's not a nice reason, and this is why she's not a true person. First, she says Lee was a good man. Lee shoot nobody, and everything was in Lee's favor. And then all of a sudden, they get a hold of her and put her on television, and she says things in her mind that her husband is guilty. And from then on, her husband's a louse. These are the things that just don't jive. And now another thing. All the witnesses told how she started complaining about everything as soon as she got there. How she treated him and how she talked about her sexual life and how she denounced him and so on and so forth, and taking up with these Russian people. This is all in black and white. I'm not imagining these things, and thank God there are other people taking this up. I say thank God because there are some people who would like to think that I have hallucinations. I know it's already been said in the Warren Report. It was said by some attorney, point blank. Do you think your sister, they said this to my sister, do you think that your sister's hallucinating? Why? Because I notice the inaccuracies and coincidences and things that just don't jive. I know some people who wouldn't hesitate to make a mental case out of me. And believe me, if anybody's in their right mind, it's Mrs. Marguerite Oswald. She paused to let this sink in and take root, and as she did so, looked me in the eye. No matter what Marina does, it's news, but logically I can show reporters something in black and white, and they won't give me coverage. This is the difference. This is where the human element comes in, and in this, where I have been persecuted and have suffered like my son. Oh, I can hear the ahs when they read this. Here's Mrs. Oswald feeling sorry for herself. No, I'm not feeling sorry for myself, but I know for a fact that I've been persecuted. What's wrong with Ms. Oswald? Why does she think she's being persecuted? Is she mentally unbalanced? I've been asked the question publicly. No, without persecution, there wouldn't be a persecution complex. This is what Freud said himself. Shut off your tape, dear heart. As I did, I was told, anticipating a confidence too sensitive or hazardous to national security to be recorded, but all she said was, "Don't you think it's too hot for coffee today? Let me make you a glass of iced tea. I've got some nice Indian iced tea and a kind of spicy flavor." Today she was wearing a blue denim jumper and a perky red and white striped shirt, and she was shod in sneakers. She looked as carefree and fun-loving as the wife of the man in the ad who has retired to Florida at the age of 50, thanks to having taken the advice of his far-sighted insurance broker. I felt that she should have been telling me more about the iced tea, but even as she emptied ice trays clamorously and rattled spoons, she rode her tempest. Maybe you saw where Marina was offered $10,000 for the guns that killed Kennedy, and the telescopic sight that went with it, and the gun that killed Tippit. I said that I had been dumbfounded. As a matter of fact, that weapons had not been acquired by the FBI or the Smithsonian Institute, but I had been reminded that they belonged to the dead man's estate and were now Marina's to dispose of as she wished. The story I had read said that a private collector was negotiating for them, and that at the time I had wondered what the manner of man he could be. Well, now, let me tell you about Marguerite Oswald being a mental case. When I read that, I said to myself, now those guns are worth a great deal more than $10,000, and Marina should get more money for my grandchildren. I am thinking about my grandchildren, so I called the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and told them what I thought, and I said those guns are priceless, but if they're going to be sold, let's see some justice done to the children of Lee Harvey Oswald. And just last week, there was an item in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram that said a Frenchman had offered $20,000. Later on that evening, back in Dallas, a newspaper reporter told me that the second offer had been topped and that Marina had received $5,000 on account and that $40,000 more was being held for her in escrow until the estate was settled. Since that time, the picture has changed altogether. So you see, I do my bit, but nobody knows, and it's a shame they don't. I'm not unhappy. You can see I'm not, can't you? But I'm a mother in history, and I'm all over the world. There's 2 precedents in my life, and my son's the one accused. You know, here is Mrs. Kennedy, a very wealthy woman. Mrs. Tippit, a very wealthy woman. Marina, very wealthy. But I am wondering where my next meal is coming from. It's almost unbelievable. It's something like almost spiritual. She brought me a dewy glass of tea with a spray of fresh mint. It was sugary and rather good, and it had no taste of tea. But here we are. We are 4 women in history, and yet I am the mother. But has anyone come forward to reimburse me for my emotional stability? No. I have given of my time and my voice, yet I have $2,300 to my name. And I have given of time and my voice, yet I have $2,300 to my name. I'm not complaining. I have my health. I eat well. I'm not brooding, but isn't it strange? Now I made a television interview with Belli in Los Angeles, and we were so good they wouldn't stop the cameras but wanted us to go for an hour instead of the half hour. And I got $100 for that. Yet Richard Burton was on the same program the next night, and he got $5,000. What do you think he did with it? He gave it to charity. He's not even an American, yet he gave it to charity. And here's Mrs. Oswald, the mother, talking about the American way of life. And where's the rent money coming from? You understand, I don't care about money. Money is only good to its use. But I need money to carry on the campaign against me and as a mother. I think I deserve it. I got fired from my job as a practical nurse because of the assassination, and it broke my heart. I didn't make only $5 a week, but I was glad to work for that because I was doing it for humanity. $5 a week, I asked, wondering what part of the century she had flashed back to. Sometimes 5, sometimes 25. 7 days a week helping people. I was fired because of the assassination, yet I was only the mother. 6 months later, when I went in the clothes locker, I saw my uniform and shoes and everything, and I just broke down. It just hit me hard, but now I half accepted this, and I feel like now I would never like to nurse again. I just don't feel like I would like to go into somebody else's sorrow. I have enough of my own. It's a hard life. Why, the very day of the assassination, I was nursing, and I heard it on the radio that my son, Lee Harvey Oswald, had been taken into custody. I came right home and called the Fort Worth Star-Telegram and asked them to send over a press car to take me to Dallas. You can push the button on again and we can drink our tea and talk at the same time. Is there anything you want to ask me? All right, let me just pause here for a moment. Okay, so she's a nurse, a practical nurse, or whatever kind of nurse. There's no record of her ever having any nurse training. All of a sudden, she's just a nurse. Right? This is nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. Oswald's mother worked her entire goddamn life in retail, in shoe sales, and working at department stores. She spent a brief stint in 1950 selling insurance. But as a nurse, no. I dare anyone out there listening to find me any record whatsoever, or even a time period, a time frame, and a location of where Marguerite Oswald went to fucking nursing school. Okay? She didn't. It didn't happen. It's a myth. It is. This is the little bit of hint or teaser or pointer in the direction of Amenth Voitier, who was actually a practical nurse, who is alleged in that book, Mistaken Identity, I forget the author's name offhand, to have been the false Marguerite. So still on the radar, but really no evidence for that other than the connection through nursing. Yes, there is, I said. When did you last see Lee? I saw Lee in the jailhouse after the assassination, and he was all bruised up with black eyes and all, and I said, "Honey, did they beat you?" And he said, "It isn't anything, Mother. I just got in a scuffle." Now this is normal. He wouldn't tell his mother if he'd been mistreated by the police, but I have my opinion. But before the assassination, how long had it been since you'd seen him? I hadn't seen Lee since October, the end of October, 1962, just about a year. That would make it, I used to do live-ins, and sometimes I'd be 200 miles away, but the truth is, Lee and Marina left Fort Worth and didn't even tell me where they were. I called Robert, and he said Lee had a box number on him, and I told Robert to make sure he took care of his brother and so on. I was not in a position to financially help, working the way I was, and another thing, I was a little miffed. They left without telling me they were leaving, and I was there that afternoon, and they left the next morning. And there's more to it than that, but never mind. And I thought, well, then they get good and ready and they'll come and see me. And I hadn't seen John Edward for years before, or Robert either, and I felt, well, I'm their mother, and when they get ready, it's their place to come and see me. I don't worry about them anymore, and this was the attitude I took with Lee and Marina. They lived for me. They lived with me for a month, and then they moved out. I'm a working person. I have to pay my own rent, make my own living, and I don't have the money or time to run back and forth, and they didn't have a car to come over here. You understand? And two, I wouldn't have a place to put them up if they came to visit me. Maybe if I had a 3-bedroom house, maybe then they'd take the bus and come over for the weekend, but I was never in that position. I'm entirely alone. I do not have even my children to discuss things with. For instance, Lee was left-handed, and right away I realized whoever shot the gun, it would make a difference. So I called Robert, and he wouldn't answer these important questions. I've suffered very much. Although Mrs. Oswald frequently made statements like this, designed to cause the blood of her interlocutor to run cold with embarrassment and to immobilize the tongue, Such was the self-protecting and even complacent nature of her hostility to the world at large and to Washington in particular, and she did not urge, indeed she did not invite, one to enter her castle rack-rent to view each tribulation separately. Rather, it was as if she had posted a notice on the door that read Black Death or Beware of the Snakes, to indicate that inside there was mortification so monstrous, so esoteric, so interactable, and paradoxically so precious that it could not be taken by any ordinary intelligence. I was guilty. I had contributed my galling bit to this treasure house of anguish and humiliation, but so had everybody else on earth. Serenely, she spoke to the microphone, smiling now and then in composure as she tallied some of life's ironies, arching her eyebrows in astonishment at some point of the most spiritual aspects of the case. You know, it's a strange thing, a very interesting thing, the way things have happened to me all my life. I said it's sometimes like a spiritual, and I would say it again now ever since right before the Warren Report came out, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram wrote that they would not run a thing on the assassination, that they had a big dose of castor oil. I asked why wasn't the Star-Telegram carrying any of my quotes. The Dallas reporters and everybody else was out at the cemetery for the year period. They wanted to hear from me, and I was on television and all, but there wasn't a thing said in the local paper about me being out at the cemetery for the year period. And of course, there were things said about the Tippits and the Kennedys, and I asked this young reporter, and he said, Ms. Oswald, they had a big dose here, but let's go back a little bit, and I'll give you an example of the way things have always worked against me. I used to work in Algiers, Louisiana. Bullshit. Here it comes. I used to work in Algiers, Louisiana during the war, and that it is across the river from New Orleans. I was a switchboard operator. My duty was 6 o'clock in the morning until 3 or 6:30. I forget which. So I rented a room in Algiers, Louisiana, and my sister was taking care of Lee permanently at this particular time. He was 2 years old. Everything, so it's 1941. So it's October 1941 to late 1942, October 42, somewhere in that range. I'm telling you, that documentation showing that she was connected with New Jersey and Nazis and the House Un-American Affairs Committee in 41 is rock solid. There's no denying it. She was in New York in 1941. She was at least in New Jersey in 41. But I'm telling you, the Broadway address and the Algiers address that was attributed to, what was it, Atlantic Avenue, 227 Atlantic Avenue. That's a fucking Staten Island address. Sorry, it's a house on Staten Island. I still need to dig deep into that one, but the other one is the Hotel Beacon, right? 2136 Broadway is the Hotel Beacon, right? And I wouldn't believe this if it wasn't right in the middle of fucking activity between Oswald's aunt and uncle, Floy Oswald, and, Mrs. James Coker. That's right, Hattie Coker. Hattie Coker and her husband are up there in New York, just a couple blocks from the Brooklyn Navy Yard. Edwin Ekdahl is up there in 42, the same year that Dewey Ekdahl, his son, confirms that he left his wife. And so, and he's only right up the road. So yeah, all the evidence in the world tells me, and those addresses are bunk, right? The addresses she gives as being in Algiers are not in Algiers. They're not even in Covington. They're not anywhere near the fucking area whatsoever. They're in fucking New York. All right, so I rented a room in Algiers, Louisiana, and my sister was taking care of Lee permanently at this particular time. He was about 2 years old. Okay, so let me just pause again. Sorry. So she was probably initially introduced to something down in Algiers. This because you have the internment camp, you have the Navy base, small Navy base there where they did repairs on ships and stuff. So she probably got turned on to a position there via family or something. Because remember, this Oswald thing has already got to be in the works. It's 41, 42. Well, actually, not necessarily. We got to 47 till the first anomalies start. So this is probably in the works, right? So Mrs. Oswald is probably turned on to something in Algiers, and then from Algiers, she decides to join the Navy, in which case, if that's the case, and that's what she had actually done, and she went to Brooklyn, or she went to New York, then she would have been in that WAVES program, which was the women's Navy training program that took place up there. And so if you Google Waves Program Navy 1940s New York, you'll find it. But that's probably the deal. She probably got turned on to something down there and then ended up going up to New York because of this Waves training program. And at this Waves training program is probably where she ended up interacting with Ekdahl. And then the rest is history. So, but yeah, make no mistake about it. The two addresses that she gave, 2136 Broadway and 227 Atlantic Avenue, those are fucking New York addresses, period. Those are not goddamn Algiers, especially since the Algiers addresses were debunked. Everyone was interviewed there and they never lived there. So that's the way it's going to go down. All right, let me continue on. Every evening I left Algiers and took the ferry and came over and took care of my baby and would have to leave early enough to get home before dark. After all, I was a woman alone to be across the river so I could go to work for 6:30. And the naval base personnel used to come up with a jeep to pick me up because there was no other way to get into the naval base. Well, this was typical of most of my life. It's a little humorous in a way, but it's typical of things that have happened to me right along. I was on this side of New Orleans, and this young lady that also roomed where I was rooming had a car, and she was coming to New Orleans, and she told me that if I were to stay over, she would take me home. Well, my two nephews had a tonsillitis operation, and I went to the hospital and stayed a little while with them. Then I met this young lady, and she had a date, and they decided that we should go into one of the nightclubs in the Vieux Carré and have a little recreation. Well, now I love to dance and go out to dinner and places like that, and so I said I would. Okay, let me pause again. So this is Marguerite Oswald. This book is obviously the false Marguerite, right? So her knowledge of the original Marguerite's early life is limited. But here she's talking about my two nephews had tonsillitis operation, okay? So some of her casual references that she says so easily, to me indicate she's one of these Claverie sisters. Like, pretty fucking, she's well enough aware of things that went on in the Claverie family without specifics to Marguerite to basically understand that you should understand that she is definitely connected to this in some way without having to have been briefed, right? So when she says that she had two nephews, what nephews is she talking about? My two nephews had tonsillitis operation. Well, we know Oswald had tonsillitis operation in 42, right? That would have been at this time. Oswald's tonsils in 42. Okay? So, this is about the time she's talking about, 41, 42. So is she talking about her own son, or is she talking about her fucking nephew? And what other nephew? Unless she's talking about Charles and Eugene Moret. Let me continue. Well, my two nephews had tonsillitis operation. I went to the hospital and stayed a little while with them. And I met this young lady, and she had a date, and they decided that we should go into one of the nightclubs. I already read that. And before I knew it, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. And what could I do? I'm with them. They have the car, and so I wait. So when I did get home, I called the other young lady who worked the evening shift for the switchboard and told her I wasn't feeling well and would she take the morning and I would take the evening. She said she would. However, it didn't please her too much. So that afternoon I was called to the colonel's office, and he asked me what happened, and I told him I wasn't feeling well and that I had been up until late and had been to the hospital. That part, of course, was true, so it was perfectly natural that I called the other young lady and asked her to change with me. However, I did dance, you see, with a few of the boys, and they happened to be men from the base, so how was I to know that? And he told me that I was not telling the truth and that I had been seen in a nightclub, and I was dancing until 2 o'clock in the morning, when I should have been home in bed resting to be there for the 6 o'clock shift, and he fired me right then and there. She allowed the climax to remain frozen for a moment before she rang the curtain down on to point the moral. This is just a little story that shows what goes on in my life. I was fired right on the spot. When I think of all things that are being said about me, I think about all these things that have happened, and there must be a simple explanation for them. It is my job to find that explanation for all the inaccuracies and distortions and so on and so forth that the people will understand. I asked only one more question that day. I did so with trepidation. I asked if he had voted in the last presidential election. She bridled, but her outrage was put on like a false nose. She said, "Why, honey? Why? You know I can't discuss my personal politics. After all, I am responsible for 2 presidents." She took off the nose and meandered on. She bemoaned the loss of mementos of Lee. Lee was a beautiful child, and this is why I gave all the pictures of him to the magazines. I got rooked financially, but this was all right because they showed a nice clean boy and a boy not underfed. But I don't have many mementos for this reason. When Lee and Marina returned from Russia, I did as I did, and with other boys as soon as they were married. I gave Lee his baby book and things of that kind, and Marina has them all now and refuses to give them to me. I gave Lee a watch that belonged to his father that was in my possession for years and years and years. It was a pocket watch, and my husband was called after the General Robert E. Lee, but he was always called Lee, you see. My first son, by Mr. Oswald, is named Robert E. Lee, and then Lee is called Lee. When Lee was born, that is, Lee Harvey Oswald, I could never say the name Lee because my husband was always called Lee. Am I making it plain? No, but go on. He was really named after the general, so I kept the watch for Lee. I had it all those years, and then I gave it to Lee when he returned from Russia. I feel like these things are mine, and I want them, but I've been very unsuccessful in getting them back. Also, there was a little navy blue wool suit that the 3 boys wore, and I have carried around for over 26 years, and it didn't even have a moth hole in it. It was an adorable little suit. Lee's picture in life, an evolution of an assassin at 6 months, has the suit on, and I gave it to my daughter-in-law, Robert's wife, just about 3 months before the assassination because I was nursing and moving around, and I asked her to keep it for me. And that has not been returned to me. Actually, I have suffered a great deal. The refrain enunciating travail came off with her customary, unwavering matter-of-factness. Among her souvenirs of Lee, Mrs. Oswald did have a little replica of a Magnus organ that I bought him while we were in New York for Christmas in 1953. I paid approximately $39.95 for it. This and other properties to whose sentimental value had been added to the historic dimension she kept in storage. She spoke of letters she had written to prominent people when Lee was in Russia. Here's a young boy, and let's say he was adventurous or anything about him, but anything he was in Russia trying to renounce his citizenship. Instead of blasting him on the front pages, why didn't they get together and see that he came home to his native land? I sent a telegram to the mayor of Fort Worth, but I didn't receive an answer. I wrote to Sam Rayburn, to Christian Herter. I wonder what became of those letters. I also wrote to Mr. Khrushchev, July 19, 1960. I stated Lee had gone to Russia in September of 1959 and that I had one letter from him in January, but my letter to him was returned, and I never heard from him again. I asked Mr. Khrushchev to supply me with any information about his whereabouts, if he was working, and so on and so forth, and I said I was much worried and deeply concerned, as a mother would be. Now, I did not receive any letter or answer from Mr. Khrushchev, and this brings up another interesting aspect of the case. The letter to Christian Herter and the letter to Sam Rayburn and the letter to Congressman Jim White all expressed the same thing. I said from what I had read in newspaper, my son said that he wanted to live in a communist country, in a working man's country, because of the communists here and the hate and racial discrimination and everything. And I made it perfectly plain that as an individual, even though he was young, he had served in the Marines and he'd become an adult, not in age but in maturity because of his hitch in the Marines, and as an individual, if this was what he wanted to do, I'm in no way wanted to influence him because I thought he had a right to his own life, and this I believe. Yet Representative Ford had a big article in Life magazine about mother's myth, son and agent, and he must have or should have known that I in no way wanted to influence my son to come home. All right. I'm going to call it here for today. We'll pick up. And we probably got, I don't know, maybe we can knock this out in a day. About 40 pages to go. If not, we'll knock it out in 2 days. So, but that's it for today, guys. Appreciate you tuning in, and I will be back tomorrow with more.